Hello again, everybody. So this is the second video in the quotation series. In this particular presentation, we're going to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of how to do quotations, rather than the broader principles that we talked about in the last PowerPoint presentation. This PowerPoint is a bit long, so at different points you might want to pause for maybe 5 or 10 minutes so you can refresh your brain and then jump back into it. Just a suggestion. I thought about breaking this up into multiple videos, but it works best as one. So here's what we're going to talk about when it comes to mechanics of quoting. We're going to talk about how to do block quotations, which we touched on in the original video that I posted first. We're going to talk about how to properly punctuate in quotations using periods and commas and colons and semicolons, because those are the most frequent punctuation marks you will use in legal writing. We're going to talk about how to alter quotations. For example, if you have to take a word out of a quotation, if you have to add a word to a quoted passage, how do you do that? And then finally, we're going to talk about how you indicate when you want to quote a passage that includes a quotation within it. How do you show a quotation within a quotation? That's what we talk about when we talk about internal quotations. And I'm covering this material because the conventions and mechanics for quoting in legal writing are somewhat different from the mechanics of quoting in other professional writing fields. So that's why. All right, so let's focus on block quotations first. As I indicated in the previous video, anytime you are quoting a passage that's 50 words or longer, you have to place it in a single spaced indented block instead of in quotation marks. And the indentations of the block have to be from the left and the right margin. All right. And as I also urged in the previous video, you shouldn't go hog wild with block quotations. Long quotations are not engaging for the reader. Most readers just either gloss over them or skip them. So use block quotations sparingly. So how would a block quotation actually look? A correct block quotation. Well, so let's assume that this is an excerpt from a brief that an attorney has written. And this is the lead-in passage to the quoted passage. It's in the attorney's own language. It's double-spaced, which is usually what's required when you are filing legal documents in court. Most courts want them double-spaced. So the lead-in passage, which is in the writer's own language, is double-spaced. However, there's the quotation, all right? And it's a lengthy quotation. I haven't counted the words, but I know it's longer than 50. So the quotation itself doesn't begin and end with quotation marks. It's blocked off, single-spaced, indented from each margin. That blocking indicates to the reader that this is a quotation, okay? And then after that, we have the citation and then another passage that, again, is in the writer's own language. You'll see here that the citation is not in the block, and that's because a citation is not part of the quoted language. This citation here to the chronic case does not appear in the block because the block comes from the chronic case. So you don't put the citation in the block, you put it in the regular double-spaced text that follows the block. Right, so that's how a correct block quotation looks. All right, let's talk about proper punctuation in quotations. We're going to cover where to put periods, where to put commas, and how to deal with colons and semicolons. So the first rule we're going to deal with is the period rule, okay? And the rule is this. When you conclude a quotation in the text of your writing, and that quotation ends with a period, you should put the period inside, in other words, before the closing quotation marks, even if that period is not part of the original passage. So here's the example. Okay, we have the quoted passage here. This is a complete sentence, so it ends with the period. You see the period in red there, and the period comes before the closing quotation mark. That's always the case. Okay, and that period needs to be there not only for grammar purposes, but also as a matter of following the Allwood Guide rule here. Commas. Commas are a little bit more complex than periods because the period rule is simple. Always put it before the closing quotation mark. You need to, well, let's just say this. We're going to talk in this slide about when you need to set off a quoted passage with a comma. All right, there are really two main situations where you need to do that. The first is when you're introducing the quoted passage with what's called a speaker identification tag. A speaker identification tag is simply a clause in which the speaker, the person or the writer who said the quote is identified. So speaker identification tag examples are she said, comma, or the court held, comma, or the court stated, comma, or the court reasoned, comma. Those all identify the source of the quoted passage in the text, okay? So whenever you introduce a quoted passage with a speaker identification tag, you need to set off the quoted passage with a comma. So that's the situation here. The speaker identification tag is the Indiana Supreme Court stated. You have the comma there in red to set off the quote, and then you have the quoted passage, all right? And you note the quoted passage is a complete sentence. When you use a speaker identification tag followed by a comma to set up the quotation, and the quotation is a complete sentence, you need to start it with a capital letter, like you have here. Sometimes the comma will just be required by the structure of the sentence itself. If the comma would be required by the rules of grammar, even if the quotation were in a sentence, then you need to include the comma. So that's the situation here. What you have at the beginning of the sentence is an introductory clause under the Indiana Supreme Court's precedent. You got to have a comma after that under the rules of proper punctuation. So when the grammar of the sentence structure requires a comma, you got to include it, okay? However, no comma is necessary when the sentence structure doesn't require it, when you don't have a speaker identification tag. Now, this is a tricky example because there is a speaker identification tag here that the Indiana Supreme Court stated, but it's followed by the word that. When you throw that in there, you don't need a comma, all right? And that's because the rules of grammar in the sentence don't require the comma. So that's why you don't have the comma here. You just have the Indiana Supreme Court stated that, and then you have the quoted passage because that's how the grammar of the sentence works. The last comma rule we're going to review here is similar to the period rule, and that when you have a comma that concludes a quoted passage, if you have to include a comma to conclude a quoted passage, you place that comma before the closing quotation marks, even if the comma didn't appear in the original passage. So here's the example here. You have the quoted passage, extreme and outrageous conduct. That's being drawn from the source. That's from the original passage. It's part of an introductory clause, which by the rules of grammar require that it ends with a comma. So the comma goes inside the quotation mark rather than after it. And that's an always rule. Anytime a comma is going to conclude a quoted passage, the comma goes inside the quotation, the closing quotation mark. All right, semicolons and semicolons. The rule here is different from the comma or the period rule in that whenever you have a colon or a semicolon that follows a quoted passage, that punctuation mark goes outside, in other words, after the closing quotation mark. So here's an example. This is the original passage from the source. Let's say it's a statute. And actually the rule here, I apologize. Let me see if I can move my little face here. I'm gonna actually move it to the bottom so it's not in the way of the rule. So this is Rule 38.4b3. So let's say we want to include the red part of this statute as a quote in a sentence that we're writing ourselves. How does that work? Well, the sentence structure itself requires a semicolon after the quoted passage. Under the rules of grammar, you have two what are called independent clauses here in a single sentence. you have to either use a period where the semicolon is, or you can use a semicolon, particularly if the two clauses are closely related. So because it's a semicolon, it does not go inside the quotation mark there, the closing quotation marks. It goes after it. This is all, I got to admit, probably a little confusing right now. You'll get better at this as you work with the rules of quotations in legal writing. It's just going to take practice. And I'm not going to come down hard on you, at least this semester, if you're not correctly putting the punctuation marks where they're supposed to be, just because it's a learning process. You'll start to get the hang of it later. All right, so let's talk about altering quotations. You know, how do you signify, for example, when you add a word to a quoted passage that wasn't in the source? Or how do you signify if you omit a word from a quoted passage in your quotation? How do you do that? Well, you either use brackets or ellipses. We're going to cover each one. So we'll start with brackets. All right. Brackets are used in the following instance. There are 5 instances. The first instance is when you replace letters in a quoted passage. In other words, the letters were one thing in the original passage, but you're changing those letters in your quotation. The second instance is where you add letters to a quotation. In other words, those letters were not in the original passage, but you're adding them for some reason. So when you add letters to a quotation, you have to indicate that with brackets. The third time you have to use brackets to indicate something is if you omit letters from a quotation. In other words, there were letters there that you're in the original passage that you're taking out in your quotation. So you got to indicate that with brackets. Fourth instance where you have to use brackets is when you replace words in a quotation. In other words, the original passage has one word, but in your quotation, when you're quoting the passage in your paper, you change that word to something different. You have to use brackets to indicate that. And finally, when you add words to a quotation, you have to indicate that with brackets. So in other words, you add a word to a quotation that wasn't in the original passage, you got to use brackets. So let's talk about, look at some examples of each one of these instances. So the first example is replacing letters. Okay, so let's say this is the original passage here. And this should be a recognizable rule. This is the definition of extreme and outrageous conduct in Indiana under a cause of action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. All right, and let's say that we want to quote this rule, but the way we are going to quote it is we're going to integrate this passage, this entire passage, in a larger sentence, part of which will include our own language. And to make that grammatically work, we have to change the C. We have to replace the uppercase C with a lowercase c. So this is how that would look like. Okay, we have an introduction there in our own words. The court held that. And to make the quoted passage work, we can't have a capital C there because it's not the beginning of the sentence. So we have to make the uppercase C a lowercase c. To do that, we indicate that replacement in brackets, as you can see there in red. If you're adding letters, same principle. So let's say this is our original passage again. We want to include consider as part of our quoted passage, but let's say because of the way we're integrating that passage into our sentence in our paper, consider is going to have to become considered with an ed on the end. The addition of the ed is going to need to be indicated in brackets. So that's what you see here. Consider becomes considered. The ed is indicated with brackets to indicate the addition. If you're omitting letters, that omission needs to be indicated with brackets. So let's say we want to, this is the original passage from the source, and we just want to quote the phrase threatened to repossess. But the way we're integrating that quotation, that passage into our sentence requires us to get rid of the ed at the end of threatened and make it just threaten. This is what it would look like. You see there that threatened ed to repossess becomes threatened to repossess. When you're omitting those letters, you indicate that omission of the letters with a blank set of brackets. I know it looks strange. You've probably never seen this in any other conventions for other professional writing, but that's how you do it in legal writing. And then replacing words. So here's our original passage again. This is our extreme and outrageous conduct definition again. Let's say we want to quote most of this passage, but the way we're going to integrate that passage into a sentence that contains partially our own words, that we're going to have to change is to was, and have to change the word the to his. This is how that would look. So, and you can see here what the writer's doing is the writer's tailoring the rule statement here, this definition of extreme and outrageous conduct, to the client's case. All right, and to do that and to integrate the quoted passage in there, got to change is to was. So that's indicated with the brackets there, as you can see in red. And you have to change the to his. And you can see that change with the brackets. And finally, we talk about adding words. So here's our original passage again. And we're gonna quote most of this passage, let's say, but integrate it into a sentence that's going to include some of our own words. And we need to add the word defendants in the passage, in the quotation. This is how that would look. You see that we've prefaced the quoted passage with the defendant's conduct was, and then continuing with the quoted passage, and we want to indicate that, you know, we're talking about this particular defendant. So we want to include the word defendants and the possessive in there. That's what we have in the brackets there. So those are all the examples of adding, replacing, in some instances, omitting, when you have to use brackets to do that. Let's talk about alterations with ellipses. Now, ellipses are used in a quoted passage to indicate when you've omitted one or more words from the original passage in your quoted passage. So let's look at an example here. So example one is when you omit words within the sentence, not at the end of the sentence, not at the beginning of the sentence, but you're omitting words from the original passage within a sentence. When you do that, you have to indicate that omission with an ellipsis. Right, so let's say that we're going to quote part of this original passage, and that we're going to integrate it into a sentence that includes our own language, and that requires us to omit the word would from the original passage in our quotation. This is how that would look. You'll note that the ellipsis there in red. An ellipsis is signified by 3 dots. Those are there in red. And under legal writing formatting, there's a space on each side of each dot. So the format is space, dot, space, dot, space, dot, space. You don't scrunch them together, which you might do in other types of professional writing. They are all separated by a space. Now, when you omit words from a quoted sentence's end, you have to include an ellipsis to indicate that omission. But you also include the sentence's final punctuation, whatever that is. Usually it's going to be a period. So here's an example of that. Let's say we want to quote this rule. It's a requirement under intentional infliction of emotional distress. But we want to omit the red part of the passage and just quote the black part in our paper. So to indicate that omission, we need to use an ellipsis. So you can see the ellipsis in red there. That's the 3 dots with the space on each side. However, you also see the period that ends the sentence there in black. So you can't omit that period. You include the ellipsis, and then you include the ending punctuation mark for the sentence, which is why the period's in there. So in this circumstance, you have 3 dot ellipsis plus a 4th dot, which is the period. Okay, what if you have a multiple sentence passage that you want to quote, but you want to omit one of the sentences? So for example, so you have this 3-sentence passage here from the source. It's stating the law with regard to intentional infliction of emotional distress. But let's say you only want to quote the first sentence and the third sentence. The second sentence, which is indicated in red, you don't want to include. So how do you indicate that in your quote? Well, you would just include an ellipsis there. So you have first sentence, period, and then your ellipsis, second sentence, period, and then you close it out with the quotation mark. Pretty straightforward. Now, there are times when you might use an ellipsis in other types of professional writing that you don't use them in legal writing. So this, I'm covering these because the conventions are different than other types of professional writing. So in legal writing, you don't include an ellipsis. You never include an ellipsis before or after a quoted passage that's incorporated into a sentence that includes your own language, okay? So let's use this example. Let's say this is our original passage from the source. Let's say we just want to quote the part in red. That's all we want to quote. The correct way of doing that is to integrate that quote into the sentence with our own language here. No ellipsis at the beginning of the quotation or the end of the quotation, even though we're omitting the beginning and the end of the passage. You don't do that in legal writing. So you would not do this. You would not include an ellipsis at the beginning and the end of the quoted passage. You never include an ellipsis at the beginning of a quoted sentence, even if you're omitting stuff from the original source that appears before that quoted sentence. So let's say that we want to quote this passage, but we just want to quote the red part. So the sentence becomes, liability does not extend to mere insults, indignities, petty threats, or annoyances, okay? That's all we want to quote. And we're just going to straight up quote that. We're not going to put it in a sentence with our own language. The correct way to do that is this. There's no ellipsis at the beginning of the sentence, even though we're omitting the phrase under this cause of action. And note there, to make the sentence work correctly from the grammar standpoint, we have to capitalize the L, all right? That requires a replacement of the lowercase l in the original passage with an uppercase L. Remember, you use brackets to indicate an alteration like that. You would not do this. You would not include an ellipsis at the beginning of the quotation, even though you might see this sort of thing in other types of professional writing, because that's what the Allwood Guide says. You follow the Allwood Guide. Last thing we're going to cover here is our internal quotations. So here we're talking about how do you indicate a quotation within a quotation. In other words, you're quoting a passage that itself contains a quoted passage. So let's say we want to quote this whole passage that appears in a case. In the case, the court quotes another source in the course of this passage. Okay, and you want to quote that. How do you indicate that? Well, you use single quotation marks. Right, so you see those in red here. So we open the quotation just like we would open a normal quotation with double quotation marks. And then the part that's quoted within the quotation is signified by single quotation marks. And note the punctuation at the end of the sentence. Okay, we got to end it with a period, right? Periods always go inside quotation marks, even if you also include a single quotation mark. So you have period, single quotation mark, and then the regular closing double quotation mark. All right, so that wraps up things. If you want to look at sources with regard to these concepts we just covered, Chapter 20, Part 3 of the Edwards text talks about them. For detailed rules, you go to the Allwood Guide, Rules 38 through 40, and Core Grammar for Lawyers, Section B, which is one of the lessons and exercises that you have to complete as part of Core Grammar, covers some of these concepts as well. So you might want to go back and recover that part of Core Grammar if you haven't already completed it. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks a lot. I'll see you in class.